just staying with the potential the implications of school closures, you say at paragraph 21 of your statement that you knew when you made the decision to close schools on the 18th of March that the consequences would be devastating for all children, but worse for vulnerable children, correct?
Yes.
And I think if we can go to the document that you've mentioned, this document of the 15th of March.
Yes.
And that's INQ 000106221.
Yeah.
That set out, didn't it, in headline form, Mr. Johnson, what the implications of the closure of schools would be. So in other words, and potentially the most significant of all, that 9 million pupils wouldn't be guaranteed to receive an education, and that any education they did receive would typically be limited, yes?
Yes.
That 1.3 million of the poorest children wouldn't receive their free school meal. That remote learning would not work for all. That schools' ability to provide it was hugely variable, and many children didn't have access to the relevant kit, and many children didn't live in adequate home circumstances or environments, and didn't have Wi-Fi. And if we drop down perhaps to the last bullet, that vulnerable children are much safer in school than out, and here pointing to the 400,000 children who had a social worker who might be at risk, and it says here from inadequate parenting, witnessing domestic violence, particularly if families are also facing the pressure of imposed isolation.
Yeah.
And presumably, Mr. Johnson, you appreciated too that below that threshold of children who had a social worker, there were many other children who would be at risk as well.
Absolutely.
Thank you, that can come down. And do you accept that the consequences for children were so grave and so far-reaching of school closures that they were the responsibility of all of government, that it wasn't just a Department for Education responsibility?
Of course. And I should say that I take, because I was saying, but as I said, told this inquiry before, I take full responsibility for all the decisions that we took, and all mistakes that were made were mistakes that I am accountable for and take responsibility for. And insofar as we got things wrong, then of course I apologise for that, and as I've done before to this inquiry. I remain very proud, of course, of a lot of things that I think the teachers, the schools did to cope with this unbelievably difficult set of circumstances. And I think that on the whole they acquitted themselves outstandingly well.
Just focusing on that, on the events of the 15th, 16th and 17th of March, can you explain why, given this whole government responsibility for the implications of school closures, why it was only on the 16th, 17th of March that, first of all, a paper was commissioned in order to set out the proposals or the options for keeping schools open?
I think that you've got to go back to the problem that we had of timing, and I think in my evidence to this inquiry earlier on, I pointed out that there'd been a great acceleration in the understanding of the scientists about where we were on the pandemic curve. And if you remember, so to the weekend of March 14th, 15th, it becomes obvious that things have moved much faster, and school closures, which March, February 10th and so on, the stage are saying are not necessarily something we'll want to bring in. I think even on March the 5th, Chris Whitty is saying it's not something we want to do imminently. It becomes clear that the spike is going up so fast that, sadly, school closures are going to have to be part of the initial package, and that's effectively what we had to do. I mean, there were other factors as well. people were, as you know, the teachers were self-isolating, and some schools were finding it difficult to operate anyway.
I think what might be very difficult to understand is why, given the gravity of the consequences of closing schools, that nonetheless seeking out papers on keeping schools open came at such last minute and just before you ended up having to make the decision to close schools.
Well, as I think I've tried to explain why I think that was the case. We were focused on trying to delay the peak of the pandemic, and we thought that the closure of schools, if it had to be used at all, would be a measure of last resort. And lastly, it was my impression that the work was being done, and I certainly assumed that the work was being done.
I'm just focusing here on why at the centre these questions are only being asked so late in the day. So in other words, the centre is only asking for proposals to keep schools open at this very, very late stage, only to reverse the position within about 24 hours and to ask for options on closing schools.
Well, I think that's entirely understandable, given the immensity of the decision and the detriments that it was likely to have.
Does the fact that these questions were being asked so late in the day demonstrate that the problem and the failures of planning were systematic failures and not just failures on the part of the Department for Education?
No, I don't. Well, as I say, I'm not certain that the Department for Education was quite as remiss as you've said, and I think my impression was that they'd done a lot of work. And when you look at what was achieved during the period when schools were closed, I think people responded pretty heroically to the challenge. You say so late in the day, but so late in the day is, of course, a phrase that is only open, or a judgment only open to people who are operating with hindsight. We didn't know how COVID was being transmitted. We didn't know to what extent children and young people were affected by it. It was very difficult. We didn't know the state of the pandemic in the country. It was very difficult to plan for how schools exactly should respond, and it remained very difficult throughout the pandemic.
But you've accepted that the possibility of school closures was being posited as a specific step that could be taken in response to the pandemic from the very earliest stages
Yes.
of the SAGE advice. And you've accepted that the implications of closing schools were enormous for almost every school-age child in this country, correct?
Yes.
And you must accept that therefore put a responsibility on government to grasp the nettle and really think about what it needed to do if schools were in fact going to close to most children.
And
yes?
as I've said to you, it looks to me as though that's exactly what the DfE was doing. And as it happens, the schools sadly did close.
Yeah.
And we did our level best to remediate the damage and to give kids the education that they needed as far as we could.